The oral tradition is coming from there. The written tradition is coming from there. The monuments are coming from there. All of it is coming from the Nile Valley. Look how close it is. Take a swim down the coast. Take a dinner cruise and come back home. This is what the pharaohs were doing. They controlled these seas for almost 3,000 years. Nothing came in here to destroy Kemet until the very end. So when you look at this art, you say, wow, that's some beautiful Kemetic art. The only problem is that this is not Kemetic art, this is Phoenician art. So the Phoenician art began to reflect that art of the teacher. Just like the things that we do today in America reflect those who've taught us. Again, this looks like Osiris, or the crown of Osiris. But this is a Phoenician crown. And when you look at the pharaoh Sesostris or Senusret, his crown is no different from the crown of the Phoenicians. Because this is where they got it from him. This brother colonized the Mediterranean world. Him and those who preceded him. In fact, according to Herodotus, he had developed a colony as far up as the Black Sea. This whole area was under Kemetic colonization. And don't take my word for it, let's go to Herodotus. He wrote, and the Egyptians, talking about these people, the Greeks were trying to figure out, well, how did these black people get all through this area? How did they get up here? And Herodotus said, well, I think that they were probably from Sesostris' army because, as we know, thousands of years before I was born, before I got any education, I read that the Sesostris had a colony of blacks all the way up to that area. And so this is how he wrote it. The Egyptians did, however, say that they thought the original Colothians were men from Sesostris' army. My own idea on the subject was based on the fact that they have what? Black skins and woolly hair. And not that that amounts to much, as other nations have the same, such as India. And secondly, and more especially, on the fact that the Colothians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only races which from ancient times have practiced circumcision. So not only did they have the black complexion, not only did they have actually the rite of circumcision, but the whole concept of the culture was intact, all the way up to the Black Sea, to show you how much power the Egyptians had at this particular time. And the Greek, he was 450 years before Christ, he's writing this. This is how he saw it. Egypt at this time was under Persian occupation. He didn't have to write that. He could have wrote what he wanted. He was a citizen. He was in Egypt because it was being dominated by foreigners. But even though he was there because of that domination, he still wrote the truth. He said these people were black. So you see Brother Sesostris here, who colonized the entire Mediterranean. Looking at the art, it's the same art. You can see time and time again. When you look at Phoenician art, it's the same art as that of the Egyptians. So you're going to tell me that they are taking us as slaves and we're teaching them? Showing you them coming as very dark complected, showing them that they're related to Africans, bringing tribute right there in ancient Kemet from Phoenicia. You can see the ships used by Sesostris. We're talking about a period about 2300 BC. We're talking about 4,300 to 4,500 years ago that they had ships like this with sails on it, navigating throughout the Mediterranean world. It's not a canoe. They had larger ships than this. They were shipping obelisks all the way down from the interior of Africa. So here you can see now they're beginning to find the evidence. Digging up all over the Mediterranean world, they're starting to find shipwrecks of Egyptian ships off the coast of Greece, going back to 1400 BC and further. The first civilizations, again, as I stated, that grew up in Europe, were not in Europe, were not on the mainland of Europe, nowhere near the mainland of Europe. They were right in the Mediterranean, right next to Africa. So, in case you think that my scholarship is lacking, I chose to bring one of the European scholars, one of their champions, in fact founded the first school of Egyptology in America, University of Chicago School of Oriental Studies, James Henry Breasted, who writes in his book Conquest of Civilization, in case you want to refer to it, he writes, because of their nearness to Egypt, it was on the Aegean Islands and not on the mainland of Europe that the earliest high civilization on the north side of the Mediterranean grew up. From the beginning, the leader in this civilization of the Aegeans was the island of Crete. The little sun-dried brick villages forming the late Stone Age settlements of Crete received copper from the ships of the Nile by 3000 BC. Man, I don't have PhD, but he had one. So if you don't believe me, maybe you'll believe him. Move on. You can see as he continues, while the great pyramids of Egypt were being built, the Cretan craftsmen were learning from their Egyptian neighbors the use of the potter's wheel and the closed oven for baking pottery. Rustic continues, and many other important things. Goes on. They rapidly learned the art of what? Navigation from the Egyptians. Their ships, the earliest sailed by Europeans, were so numerous that their rulers are often called the sea kings of Crete. So here you have, they wouldn't even be sea kings if it hadn't been for the brothers here coming here teaching them navigation as far back as 3000 BC. But Dr. Ben and his students, they're emotional. They're emotional. They don't deal with facts. See, there's a difference between being emotional and presenting facts with emotion. We have to learn how to make that distinction, how to differentiate between those two qualities. We move on, we can see that Isis was also considered to be the goddess of the navigational period. The Greeks and the Romans actually worshipped her as a goddess who opened up the ceremony of navigation during a festival which they called the Navagium Asutis about March 5th every year, to open up the spring. Now you may see a picture of a guy, I don't have it in this lecture today, but sometimes you see on the bow of a ship a woman. The virgin represented on the bow of a ship goes all the way back to Isis, who was considered to be the queen of navigation. And don't take my word for it, let's go here to Alexander Moret's book, Kings and Gods of Egypt, as he writes, they crossed the sea yet again in trading vessels, and their coat was spread abroad by the merchants and sailors who all worship Isis, star of the sea, protector of seafaring men. Leaving the ports of the Hellenic Mediterranean, their galleys sailed along the coast of Italy, Gaul, and Spain. That's France, Gaul, and Spain, bringing the worship of Isis to all the places they visited and leaving everywhere behind them testimony precious to us in the form of statues recently discovered which have revealed how widespread was the cult of the Egyptian goddess. The queen of navigation. So here you have a people who are supposed to be landlocked and can't swim actually being worshipped by the Greeks and Romans and opening up their season of navigation. On the island of Crete, as you can see in Simet's tomb, showing the people from Crete bringing tribute to Egypt that they have learned from the Egyptians. The oldest known shipwreck in the world found, an Egyptian ship off the coast of Crete. National Geographic, not Brother Mathu. We move on, we can see Brother Jamal Gori standing there in the Osirian stance with his left foot forward, symbolizing the way of the heart, the way of truth, because the heart is on the left side of one's body. The way of truth, so that when they started learning from us, they started doing their sculpture just like us. Left foot forward, the hands down, barren and naked. Learning the concept of the Osirian stance from that of the Egyptians. So mathematically, even they looked at it mathematically and found the same canon of the golden section, the golden numbers was there. The control, the statuary and art of ancient Crete was exact and identical to that of ancient Kemet. So can Africans navigate, is the question that we've been asking. The Romans painted the priest of Egypt. When they painted the priest, they clearly differentiated the priest from themselves. As you can see, the black priest sprinkled throughout the crowd. The whites over here and the black priest here, the priest of Isis. See them constantly. The Romans knew they were black. They painted them black. Move on, we can see the first boats in recorded history. These are the oldest paintings of any boat on the earth. Going back 4000 BC in Nubia. With the goddess, the symbol of the goddess Hathor here, the great mother here, again associated with navigation. This heritage coming all the way from the interior of Africa to Egypt, right to Greece, right to Rome. The queen of heaven, the queen of navigation, the queen of the waters. Here's the oldest boat known with a sail on it. Going back before 3000 BC, nowhere in the world did anybody, even in the world, paint a picture of a boat with a sail on it. Here's 3000 BC, a boat with a sail on it in Nubia, not in Egypt. And you can see, even in the spirit of the people there today, the little brothers, the little Nubians playing with boats, because the Nile was the life of Egypt. There could be no life in Egypt without this river. It is this river that brought to them over 80 billion cubic tons of alluvium every year to give life to a barren desert. And it was in this alluvium that they planted their seed to grow their crops, to nourish their nation, to give their nation life. And they looked to the south, the place with the topsoil, the black kemet, the rich and red and black earth that came to Egypt and gave life to it. They said the god Ptah, the god Asaru, Osiris, sat on his great throne in the interior of Africa, and they have blessed them today because they have sent them so much rich soil to give life to this barren desert, which was Egypt. It only makes sense when you look to the interior of Africa. The whole thing doesn't make sense until you look into the interior of Africa. As you see King Tutankhamun, just like the small boy playing with the boat, when the first thing you saw on his tomb, the young boy king had boats that he played with, because the river of life, that was the highway, that was the freeway, back and forth, up and down, all throughout the Mediterranean world. They were navigating. This is the only way they could be a strong nation for 3,000 years, is to have control of the waters like the United States had control of the air when they fought Saddam Hussein. There's no difference. They had to have control over the waters, or Egypt wouldn't have stood 3 years, much less 3,000 years. When they died, they believed that they needed a boat to sail up the Nile to the interior of Africa, to God's land, and they buried the boats right along with them. Everything was centered around boats, life and death. Water was sacred.
Beautiful black bodies steadily stalk concrete streets, quietly concealing calypsoic currents amid camouflage identities. But stark naked reality testifies, as subtle as sunlight, cutting across carefully structured frames and boldly molded muscles. The truth cannot be denied, because heredity refuses to hide. Africans born in America bear striking resemblance, peaceful reminiscence of Egyptians, Nubian, Hausa, Fulani. We be Watusi tall, pygmy small, our ancestors constantly.
Then we get stories about people who have come into Africa and studied. He was a young boy fleeing from Herod, who was trying to murder him. And they said the young boy Jesus fled into Egypt to avoid his death. And then when he came back out of Egypt, he was talking real revolutionary, calling the Jews liars, said, "You are liars and the father of a lie. You are not the chosen people of God." Why did he say that? Because he'd gone into Egypt and learned that the Jews had learned this whole concept of religion right there in Egypt. And he was an Egyptian scribe himself. And so he came out doing what the Egyptians, of course, this is not him. I want to make that clear. This is not him. I mean, the brother, here you got these black priests, right? And so if the CIA, or the Roman Legion, if you prefer, are looking for him, and they want to find this brother, he can't hide as a white, blind, blue-eyed white person in the midst of all these shaven-head black priests that I've been showing you that the Romans painted. The Romans painted the priests as black. So how can he be this color and run in there and hide amongst these priests from the Romans? The Romans were in control of the land at the time. It was just like today, a criminal can go into the Vatican for sanctuary and isolation, and the government of Rome can't do anything about it because the Vatican is its own state. So the one place that the Romans would not go into was the temples, because it would irritate and could cause problems with the masses of the people if they desecrated the temples. It's the one place that he could go. Move on. So another man you may have remembered called Moses, but you would think that this was a passage right out of the Bible, but this comes from the 4th dynasty of one of the magicians called Jeddah monk for the Pharaoh Khufu. And look what he does. Let me just set the situation up. There were some sisters doing a dance, and one of them had lost a turquoise necklace into the water. And she became sad and stopped dancing. The Pharaoh said, "What is the problem? I lost my necklace." He called on his priest and said, "What can you do about it? Here, pick it up from there." Then said the chief lector, Jedi monk, his magic sayings, he placed one side of the water of the lake upon the other, and lying upon the parts that he found a fish-shaped charm. Then he brought it back and gave it to his owner. Now as for the water, it was 12 cubits deep, and it amounted to 24 cubits after it was folded back. He said his magic sayings, and he brought back the water of the lake to its position. So here's a priest in Egypt, under the Pharaoh Khufu, 2,700 years BC, 4,700 years ago, parting water, long before Abraham, long before Moses, long before all those people who came in there and learned how to part some water. So here you get Jesus walking on water, Moses parting the water. The Bible clearly saying he studied for 40 years in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. You got Charleston Heston and Edmund G. Robinson standing over here at Universal Studios. Gonna part the Red Sea. Now we see where he learned how to part that Red Sea from, don't you? So the Egyptians were the masters of water. They saw their entire existence bordered and hinged on the concept of water. The water that the woman gave birth to the child, as the inundation process began as the child came bellowing out of her interior. The concept of the water as they would sail up and down the highways doing commerce, then the south, commerce in the north. And when they died and went to heaven, the boat to take them back to the interior of Africa. And later as they became gods in a bark, they would travel across the heavens in a boat. So if anybody on the face of the earth could make the trip to America, we know it was the Egyptians. Nothing could stop the Egyptians. So Thor Heyerdahl, European, he knew that. And so what he did, he looked at these boats, these Egyptian vessels, and he chose the most primitive type, the papyrus reed, and said, I'm going to prove that the ancient Egyptians could sail to America. This was his calling. This is what he wanted to do. So you can see he looked at the brothers, clearly see that they were brothers, and didn't look anything like him. And so what he did is he said, okay, they don't look like me. Let me go find some people who look like them. So he went to Chad in the interior of Africa, and he found some brothers who looked just like the brothers on the boats, who were making the same kinds of boats. And he brought these brothers back to Egypt and built a boat right in front of the pyramids in Egypt. Why didn't we get this in class? Did anyone teach us this in class? At the university, at the high school, at the junior college, at the elementary school, at the preschool, in the home. Nobody taught us this. So in case you think I'm just jiving you, here's the pyramid and the boat in front of it, where they built the boat based on the Egyptian Canaan right in front of the pyramids in Egypt. Heyerdahl understood that the reason that white folks couldn't get across to America and they thought the world was flat is that they were traveling against the currents. And that if you traveled along the currents of West Africa, the currents would bring you right to America. Anything that was able to stay afloat would come naturally to America. A bottle, a person, anything that could stay afloat would naturally come to America. He knew that. So he knew that white folks, in fact, had not discovered the whole world. As you see them here teaching their little kids that we discovered this, here it is, big finger right here on America. We discovered it. No brothers in sight. Got Magellan and Columbus and De Leon, and now they're discovering the universe. For the Europeans. But the Dogon, as Brother Simi and Brother and Sister Alma have been to the Dogon land, they've already been out in the universe. That's a long story. We won't get into that one. We'll let you look at that brother's lecture. We move on. So the white folks thought the world was flat. And you can see here, it's not Brother Mathu making this up. In 1492, their science was in such a state that they believed that the world was flat and that if you sailed off into the Atlantic, you'd fall off the edge of the earth or be devoured by some hideous monster. This was the extent of their science at this particular time in the year 1492. But what made the Europeans want to navigate in 1492? All of a sudden you have Spain, the nation again like Greece, closest to Africa, sponsoring a navigational trip, an expedition to America. They don't teach us about the Moorish occupation that took place. For over 700 years the Moors had controlled that particular land and brought about a renaissance, which they called the Renaissance. The Moors were there to the year 1492, the very year that Columbus set sail Queen Isabella and Ferdinand expelled the Moors out of Spain. The same year he launched the ships to America. All over the East, they knew about Africans and their navigation. They had talked about Abubakar II and how he had sent 400 ships across the Atlantic to see what was across the Atlantic. In fact, not only did he send 400, but he got in the ship and sailed himself. We know this from a Moroccan historian who wrote about this in Cairo. This is the year 1310, not 1492. So Columbus, or Colon, a Jewish background, who were Jewish merchants selling throughout the Mediterranean, they got a hold of some of these stories. We know that this is what happened. This is why he got so interested in going to America to find this land which they called Atlantis in ancient times. So Heyerdahl knew this. So Heyerdahl took the same route that Columbus had learned about from the Moors. And the Moors had learned about from translating the Egyptian and the Greek and Egyptian texts about navigation. They knew the world was round long before the Greeks knew the world was round. Long before the Europeans knew the world was round. In Kemet, we knew the world was round. Imhotep knew the world was round. So here you can see Heyerdahl mapping out his course, how he was going to come to America. Got in his boat just like he saw in the Kemetic museums, and he sailed to America. Not once, but twice. In Raw 1 and Raw 2. And he said at this particular point, whenever one considers who populated and who brought the first high culture to America, they will not be able to leave out the Egyptians because of his navigational experiences. That's important. So then we look at the reason for navigating. Why would the Egyptians want to navigate across the Atlantic? And again, if we go back to the Bible, maybe we'll find the answer here. As we can see, you take this one off here. As we can see here, Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. We see here in the Bible where Moses has married a black woman. Ethos being burnt and Opes being faced, the black faced one. Moses has in fact married her. This is a fact. Now we're talking about a time when he was supposed to have a confrontation with a man named Ramesses. The 19th dynastic period, approximately 1200 or so years BC. And it's just a coincidence that around 1200 BC, the first high culture was developed in the Americas. So Moses had married a black woman. Now what's interesting is this particular pharaoh, Ramesses II, who he was supposed to have had his confrontation with, he also married an African or a Nubian woman. Not that he wasn't an African himself, but he married a woman that was from Nubia. A woman named Nefertari, which means more beautiful than beautiful. And she was his favorite wife. She was the most important woman in the Mediterranean world. And initially he married her for a treaty with the Nubians because at this time he was waging battles against the powers in the north, the Hittites, the Assyrians, and those who wanted to sack Egypt. As an alliance, he married this daughter of the Pharaoh of Nubia for an alliance, but he began to love her more than any of his wives. And so she became the most important woman in the Mediterranean world, this Nubian woman. And in fact, the breadth of the Egyptian army was made up of Nubians from the south. In fact, the very name of the armies that they assigned to the armies in Egypt meant Nubians.